The blizzard hit 20 below. Wind shrieked like broken glass across the Montana plain, turning breath to ice before it left a man's lungs. Silas Drummond squinted through the white, his leather reins cracking stiff in his grip as he rode the fence line at dusk. That's when he saw them. Two shapes collapsed 50 yards from his gate, one dragging the other through snow that cut like razors. The woman's lips were blue. The child's hands were frozen to her mother's coat sleeve, fingers locked in rigor around rough wool that smelled of wood smoke and desperation. Silas dismounted, his boots punching through the crust, and knelt beside them. The woman's eyes found his, pale green, already distant. "Vernon," she whispered through blood-flecked foam. "Poison my tea. Don't let him take her land." Her hand went slack. A music box tumbled into the snow, carved pine, brass hinge glinting in the dying light. The child, maybe 9 years old with blonde braids caked in ice, didn't cry. She just stared at her mother's still face, clutching that box like it held her last breath. By dawn, Helen Hayes was dead in Silas's guest room. By noon, Vernon Caldwell arrived with a sheriff and papers, his voice loud enough for the whole territory to hear. "That's my niece, Drummond, and her 2,000 acres of copper land." Silas stood between the child and Vernon's outstretched hand. The sheriff shifted his weight, hand near his belt. Vernon's smile was all teeth and no warmth. "I've got legal papers, Drummond. You've got nothing but sentiment." The ground was too frozen to dig. Ezra Tate's crew used pickaxes for 2 hours before they hit soft earth, the iron ringing against permafrost like church bells in the cold air. Silas stood with his hat in his hands, the wind carrying the smell of turned dirt and snow. Cora knelt beside the pine coffin, silent as stone, that music box pressed against her chest. Father Brennan's voice wavered through the Lord's Prayer. His hand trembled on the Bible, not from cold, Silas noticed, but from something else. Something that made the old priest's eyes dart toward Vernon Caldwell, who watched from the tree line 50 yards back, his horse stamping in the snow. When they lowered Helen into the ground, Cora placed the music box on the coffin lid. Silas reached down gentle as he could and returned it to her small hands. She looked up at him then, those green eyes just like her mother's, and he saw his own daughter's face for a half-second before the memory bled away. Vernon filed his guardianship petition at the courthouse that same afternoon. Silas found out from Ezra, who'd been shoeing horses near the land office when Vernon's lawyer swept in with papers 2 inches thick. "He's claiming Helen wrote him a letter," Ezra said, pulling a red-hot horseshoe from the coals. The forge hissed and sparked, filling the blacksmith yard with the smell of hot iron and coal smoke. "Named him guardian a week before she died. Says the child's inheritance needs family management." "Family," Silas spat the word like poison. He let her freeze in a blizzard while he sat warm in town. Judge Blackwood set a hearing for February 15th, 30 days. Ezra hammered the shoe, each strike deliberate and true. "You filing a counter petition?" "Already did." The courthouse smelled of old paper and wax seals. Judge Miriam Blackwood presided from her bench, her silver hair pulled back severe, her eyes missing nothing. Vernon sat with his lawyer, a Helena man in a wool suit too fine for Bitterroot, with anaconda copper cufflinks catching the lamplight. "Your Honor," the lawyer began, sliding a letter across the bench. "Mrs. Helen Hayes, in sound mind and body, named my client, Vernon Caldwell, as legal guardian of her daughter, Cora, should anything befall her. The letter is dated January 7th, 1 week before her tragic death." Silas leaned forward. The letter was written in cursive, neat and flowing. Helen's signature sat at the bottom, clear as day. Judge Blackwood studied it, then looked at Silas. "Mr. Drummond, you filed a counter petition claiming temporary guardianship based on the deceased's verbal request. Do you have witnesses to this request?" "She was dying, Your Honor. It was just me and the child." "Convenient," Vernon's lawyer murmured. Ezra stood from the gallery. "Your Honor, I knew Helen Hayes, taught her to write her own name when she first came to Bitterroot 6 years back. She couldn't write cursive, only printed letters. That signature's a forgery." The lawyer didn't blink. "Mr. Tate is a blacksmith, not a handwriting expert. The signature matches Mrs. Hayes's mark on her land deed, filed with this very court in 1884. Judge Blackwood set the letter down. "Mr. Drummond, I'm granting you temporary custody pending investigation. But Mr. Caldwell has blood rights. And this letter, forged or not, deserves examination. You have 60 days to prove Miss Hayes is better off with a stranger than her own kin." Her gavel cracked like a gunshot. Vernon smiled across the aisle, cold and patient. Outside the courthouse, Silas found Ezra waiting by the horses. The wind had picked up, carrying the smell of snow and distance. Cora sat in the wagon bed, wrapped in blankets, that music box on her lap. "He met with an Anaconda copper man twice this month," Ezra said quiet. "Telegraph office clerk saw the papers. Something about mineral rights on the Hayes claim. 2,000 acres, Silas. They're saying there's copper beneath that creek boundary." Silas looked back at the courthouse, at Vernon descending the steps with his lawyer, both of them laughing about something. $50,000 in copper, and a 9-year-old girl was all that stood between Vernon and a fortune he didn't earn. "February 15th, Silas said. "We've got till then," Ezra nodded. "Then we'd better find out what Helen really wanted, because that letter's lying, and we need to prove it before the judge runs out of patience." Vernon mounted his horse and tipped his hat toward Silas, the gesture all mockery. Then he rode north toward his claim, leaving hoofprints in the snow that filled in slow as the wind howled. Judge Blackwood's words hung in the frozen air. 60 days to prove she's safer with you than her own blood. The mercantile smelled of tobacco and coal oil, the iron stove ticking as it cooled in the corner. Silas needed flour and coffee, basic supplies to get through the week. Cora walked beside him, her hand tucked in his coat pocket, her other arm wrapped around that music box like it might vanish if she let go. Mrs. Potts stood behind the counter, her mouth pinched tight. Mrs. Chen, who ran the shop with her husband, was measuring out sugar when they entered. The bell over the door rang once, and both women looked up. Their conversation died mid-sentence. "Morning," Silas said, removing his hat. Mrs. Potts didn't return the greeting. She folded her arms across her flour-dusted apron and stared at Cora. "That child's got 2,000 acres of copper land sitting under her name. Whole territory knows it." "She's got her mother's claim," Silas agreed, keeping his voice level. "What of it?" "What of it?" Mrs. Potts stepped forward, her boots heavy on the plank floor. "Your ranch has been dying for 3 years, Drummond. Everyone knows you're land poor since Martha passed. Now suddenly you're taking in orphans with $50,000 in mineral rights?" The words hit like fists. Cora's hand tightened in his pocket, and he felt her shrink against his leg. Mrs. Chen looked away, busying herself with the sugar scoop. The sound of it scraping the barrel filled the silence. Sharp, rhythmic, damning. "Helen Hayes asked me to protect her daughter with her dying breath," Silas said quiet. "That's what I'm doing. Vernon Caldwell says different. Says you manipulated a sick woman, turned her against her own family." Mrs. Potts moved to the door, blocking it. "That child belongs with blood kin, not a stranger trying to steal her inheritance. Don't take us for fools, Drummond." Doc Ruth Holloway appeared in the doorway, her black medical bag in hand. She was 64, gray hair pulled back practical, her eyes sharp as a scalpel. "Margaret Potts, you want to move aside, or do I need to diagnose you with an acute case of gossiping stupidity?" Mrs. Potts flushed red, but stepped away from the door. Doc Ruth looked at Silas. "Get your supplies and go. I'll walk you out." Outside, the February wind cut through their coats. The smell of wood smoke from a dozen chimneys mixed with horse manure and frozen mud. Cora climbed into the wagon without a word, curling up in the back with the flour sacks. "Vernon's been spreading stories," Doc Ruth said, her breath misting in the cold. "Half the town thinks you're using that child to save your ranch. The other half doesn't know what to think." "What do you think?" She looked at him straight. "I think Helen Hayes died harder than she should have. I treated her for 3 months, what I thought was winter flu, but her symptoms—" Doc Ruth pulled her coat tighter. Hair falling out in clumps, vomiting that wouldn't stop, convulsions near the end, those blue lips you saw, that's not hypothermia alone. Silas felt something cold settle in his gut. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying I've seen arsenic poisoning twice in 40 years. Helen's death looked just like it." She glanced back at the mercantile, where faces watched from the window. "But I can't prove it without exhuming the body, and I need a judge's order for that." "Vernon would fight it?" "Fight." "Of course he would, which is why I need you to trust me." She set her medical bag in the wagon. "And I need Judge Blackwood to believe there's cause." 3 days later, Silas stood in Judge Blackwood's chambers. The room smelled of pipe tobacco and old leather. Vernon sat across the table with his Helen, a lawyer, both of them calm as Sunday. "Your Honor," the lawyer began, "Mr. Drummond has filed a motion requesting emergency custody modification based on unsubstantiated accusations of foul play. This is a transparent attempt to delay proceedings and poison public opinion against my client." Judge Blackwood looked at Doc Ruth, who'd been called as a witness. "Doctor, You're claiming Mrs. Hayes was murdered. I'm claiming her symptoms warrant investigation. Arsenic poisoning presents identically to what I observed. If I'm wrong, an autopsy will clear it up. If I'm right, Doc Ruth's voice didn't waver, then this isn't a custody case anymore. It's a murder trial. Vernon leaned back in his chair, his face a mask of wounded innocence. My sister was sick for months. Half the territory had the winter flu. This is grief talking, Your Honor, not medicine. Mrs. Hayes confided in me that her brother pressured her repeatedly to sell her land, Doc Ruth said. She refused. 3 weeks later, she was dying. The lawyer smiled thin. Hearsay, Your Honor. And even if true, familial disagreements over property are hardly evidence of murder. The doctor is grasping at shadows because Mr. Drummond is a friend of hers. Judge Blackwood was quiet for a long moment. Outside, the telegraph office clacked with afternoon messages. A horse stamped on the frozen street. I'll grant the exhumation order, the judge finally said. If there's poison, we need to know. But Mr. Caldwell, you're entitled to supervised visitation starting this Sunday, 1 hour weekly until the custody hearing. Vernon's smile widened. Thank you, Your Honor. Doc Ruth's jaw tightened, but she nodded. Silas felt the world tilt sideways. 1 hour alone with Cora, 1 hour for Vernon to work on her, to threaten her, to undo everything. Judge Blackwood's gavel came down. Sunday at 10. Don't be late, Mr. Drummond. Outside, the wind carried the smell of snow coming. Vernon descended the courthouse steps beside his lawyer, both of them talking low. When Vernon passed Silas, he stopped. I'll collect her Sunday morning, he said, voice loud enough for the dozen people on the street to hear. Make sure she's ready. And Drummond? His eyes were empty as January sky. This isn't over, not by half. Cora's hand went cold in Silas's grip. Doc Ruth's office smelled of carbolic acid and dried herbs hanging from the ceiling beams. She spread Helen's medical file across her desk, the pages covered in tight handwriting, dates, symptoms, treatments that hadn't worked. Cora sat in the corner on a wooden stool, silent as always, her fingers tracing the carved edges of the music box. Look at this progression, Doc Ruth said, tapping each entry. November, nausea, headaches. December, hair loss, tremors in the hands. January, severe vomiting, blue discoloration of the extremities, convulsions. She looked up at Silas. I treated it as influenza complicated by malnutrition. But influenza doesn't cause hair to fall out in patches. Arsenic does. Silas studied the notes, the careful record of a woman dying by inches. How long does it take? Depends on the dose. Small amounts over 3 months, long enough that it looks like natural illness. Smart if you're trying to hide murder. She closed the file. The territorial coroner in Helena can test bone marrow for arsenic sulfide. It concentrates in the bones, stays there even after death. But I need that exhumation order enforced before Vernon finds a way to block it. Judge Blackwood granted it yesterday. Then we move fast. Tomorrow morning before Vernon knows what's happening. Doc Ruth pulled on her coat, the wool still damp from yesterday's snow. I'll need you and Ezra as witnesses. And Silas, if I'm right about this, everything changes. This stops being about custody and becomes about justice. The February dawn was gray and bitter. They opened Helen's grave with the same pickaxes that had dug it, the sound of iron on frozen earth ringing across the cemetery. Father Brennan stood watch, his breath misting, his hands clutched around his prayer book like he was holding onto something precious that kept trying to slip away. Doc Ruth worked quickly, extracting samples of bone marrow with instruments that gleamed cold in the weak light. She sealed each vial with wax, labeled them in her precise hand, then packed them in a wooden case lined with straw. How long for results? Silas asked. Telegraph to Helena today. Helena. 3 days, if the coroner prioritizes it, maybe a week. She looked at the open grave, at the coffin they'd have to lower again and cover with earth that would freeze solid by nightfall. If there's arsenic, Vernon Caldwell will hang. If, Ezra said quiet. When, Doc Ruth corrected. They rode back to town in silence, the cold seeping through their coats. The mercantile was just opening when they passed, and Mrs. Chen stood in the doorway watching them with something that might have been sympathy, or might have been fear. That afternoon, Doc Ruth filed her petition with Judge Blackwood. Silas wasn't there for it, but Ezra was, and he came straight to the ranch afterward with the news. Vernon went wild, Ezra said, warming his hands by the stove. The smell of coffee filled the kitchen, cutting through the cold. Threatened to sue Doc Ruth for defamation. His lawyer claimed exhuming a body without family consent was illegal, immoral, and a violation of Helen's dignity. What did the judge say? That if there's poison in those bones, dignity's the least of Vernon's problems. Ezra accepted the cup Silas poured him. But she also said the custody hearing stands, February 15th, 3 weeks from now, whether we have answers by then or not. Cora appeared in the doorway, still wearing the borrowed dress Doc Ruth had given her, too big in the shoulders, hemmed up with uneven stitches. She looked at both men, but didn't speak. She never did, not since that first night. "Hey there, little one," Ezra said gentle. "You doing all right?" She nodded once, then turned and walked back toward her room. The music box was tucked under her arm, never more than 3 feet from her body. "She hasn't said a word in 2 weeks," Silas said after she was gone. "Not even to me." Shock does that. Saw it in the war, men who watched their friends die, then couldn't talk for months. Ezra stared into his coffee. "She saw something, Silas. Something she can't say yet." 3 days crawled past. Sunday came with a weak sun and wind that cut like knives. At 10 o'clock, Vernon's horse appeared at the end of the drive. Silas watched from the porch, Cora standing rigid beside him. Vernon dismounted slow, making a show of brushing snow from his coat. "Good morning, niece," he said, his voice carrying false warmth. "Ready for our visit?" Cora's hand found Silas's and held on. "1 hour," Silas said. "On the porch, in sight." Vernon's jaw tightened. "The judge said supervised visitation. She didn't specify conditions." "I'm specifying them." For a moment, Vernon looked like he might argue. Then he smiled, all teeth, and climbed the porch steps. "Fine, we'll sit right here where everyone can see how reasonable I'm being." He sat on the bench, and Cora slowly, reluctantly sat beside him. Silas moved to the far end of the porch, close enough to hear, far enough to give the appearance of privacy. Vernon spoke low, his words meant only for the child, but the wind carried pieces of it, your mother would want, and family takes care of family, and that land is yours, but you're too young to manage it alone. Cora stared at her hands, at the music box in her lap. She didn't look at her uncle once. At the end of the hour, Vernon stood. "Same time next week," he said to Silas. Then to Cora, "Think about what I said, sweetheart, about what your mama really wanted." He rode away as the clouds rolled in, promising more snow. Cora watched him disappear down the road, then finally looked up at Silas. Her eyes were wet, but she didn't cry. The telegram arrived at dusk. Doc Ruth brought it herself, riding through the growing storm. She dismounted fast and held the paper out, her hand shaking. Silas read it twice. Bone marrow sample positive, arsenic sulfide, quantity lethal over 90 days. Dr. Halloway, territorial coroner. Vernon had 3 days before the sheriff came. Vernon didn't wait for the sheriff. He held a public meeting on the courthouse steps at noon. Half the town gathered in the cold to hear him. Silas stood at the back of the crowd, Ezra beside him, both watching as Vernon played the role of wounded brother with the skill of a snake oil preacher. "My sister was a fragile woman," Vernon began, his voice carrying across the frozen square. The smell of horses and tobacco smoke hung in the air. "Her husband died 2 years back in a mining accident, left her alone with a child to raise and land she couldn't work. She fell into despair. Any of you who knew Helen can testify to that." Murmurs of agreement rippled through the crowd. Mrs. Potts nodded. 3 homesteaders Silas recognized crossed their arms, their faces set. "The winter was hard on her. She couldn't eat, couldn't sleep. I visited every week, brought her supplies, tried to help." Vernon's voice cracked just right. "And when I found arsenic in her tea canister last month, I confronted her. She broke down crying, said she couldn't go on, begged me not to tell anyone because of the shame it would bring on Cora." The crowd shifted. Someone gasped. Silas felt his hands curl into fists. "I tried to get her to see Doc Ruth, tried to take the poison away, but she hid it, and God forgive me, I didn't watch her close enough." Vernon wiped his eyes. "Now Drummond's using her death to steal my niece's inheritance, twisting a suicide into murder because he needs that copper land to save his failing ranch." Sheriff Dawes stood near the courthouse door, his expression unreadable. Judge Blackwood watched from a second-floor window, her face like granite. "That's a lie," Silas called out, heads turned. "Helen Hayes told me with her dying breath that Vernon poisoned her. Doc Ruth's coroner report proves arsenic killed her." "Proves she had arsenic in her body," Vernon's lawyer interjected smoothly. "Doesn't prove who put it there. Self-administered poison shows the same in an autopsy as murder. The only difference is intent, and intent requires proof Mr. Drummond cannot provide." Ezra stepped forward. I found receipts. Vernon met with Anaconda Copper twice in January, negotiating mineral rights on land he doesn't own. That's motive. Business discussions aren't crimes, and the lawyer said. My client was exploring options to help his sister manage her estate. She was overwhelmed, alone, suicidal. Anyone in town can confirm her state of mind. The crowd was nodding now. Silas could see it happening, the story taking root. Vernon wasn't a murderer. He was a grieving brother trying to help a desperate woman who'd taken her own life. And Silas was the outsider, the rich rancher who'd swooped in to claim an orphan's fortune. Doc Ruth pushed through the crowd. I treated Helen Hayes for 3 months. She never once mentioned despair or suicide. She talked about spring planting, about teaching Cora to read, about protecting her daughter's future. With respect, Doctor, Mrs. Potts said from the crowd. Suicidal people don't always advertise their intentions. My cousin seemed fine, right up until he... She stopped, looked down. The territorial coroner's written report arrived an hour later, delivered by telegraph. Judge Blackwood read it aloud in the courthouse, the room packed shoulder to shoulder. The air was thick with body heat and tension. Arsenic sulfide detected in bone marrow at concentrations consistent with lethal poisoning administered over a period of 3 months. Manner of death, consistent with both homicide and suicide. Further investigation required to determine intent. Vernon's lawyer stood. Your Honor, this confirms what my client has stated. Mrs. Hayes died by arsenic poisoning, self-administered due to depression. We request the custody hearing proceed as scheduled and that Mr. Drummond be investigated for exploitation of a vulnerable child. Judge Blackwood looked at Silas. Mr. Drummond, do you have evidence beyond the deceased's alleged statement that this was murder and not suicide? The child, Silas said. Cora saw something. She won't talk yet, but she's terrified of Vernon. That's evidence. A traumatized 9-year-old who hasn't spoken in 3 weeks is not a reliable witness, the lawyer countered. And her fear could just as easily be grief and confusion, manipulated by Mr. Drummond's influence. Sheriff Dawes, the judge said, I want a full investigation. Interview everyone who knew Mrs. Hayes. Search her property for the arsenic source. And Mr. Caldwell, you're not to leave the territory until this is resolved. Of course, Your Honor. Vernon's face was the picture of cooperation. Outside, the sky had gone slate gray. Snow began to fall, light and dry. Silas helped Cora into the wagon, and she climbed into the back without being asked, wrapping herself in blankets. Doc Ruth and Ezra stood on the courthouse steps, their faces grim. He's winning, Doc Ruth said quietly. The town wants to believe the suicide story. It's easier than thinking one of their own is a murderer. The ride back to the ranch was silent, except for the wagon wheels crunching through fresh snow and the wind picking up through the pines. Silas kept checking on Cora in the back, but she'd pulled the blanket over her head, curled around that music box like it was the only solid thing in the world. They were a mile from town when Silas heard it. Hoofbeats behind them, coming fast. He turned to look. 4 riders, faces wrapped against the cold. Silas, Ezra called from beside him. He'd ridden escort, and now his hand moved toward the rifle on his saddle. The first rock hit the wagon bed with a crack. The second shattered the seat beside Silas's leg. Cora screamed, the first sound she'd made in weeks, and Silas pulled the horses hard to the right, off the road into the snow. Go back to your tomb, Drummond, someone shouted. Leave that child's gold alone. Another rock whistled past his head. Ezra pulled his rifle, fired once into the air. The riders scattered, but their voices carried back through the snow. Thief! Land grabber! Rich bastard! Silas turned the horses toward home, his hands shaking on the reins. In the back, Cora was sobbing into the blankets, and he could hear her trying to catch her breath, that awful hitching sound of a child whose fear had finally broken through. Behind them, the town of Bitterroot disappeared into the white, and Silas knew with cold certainty that they'd lost more than the crowd's sympathy. They'd lost safety itself. The ranch was quiet that night, except for the wind testing the windows and the pop of logs in the fireplace. Silas made soup from dried beans and salt pork, the smell filling the kitchen with something warm and ordinary. Cora sat at the table, her hands wrapped around a cup of milk she hadn't touched, the music box beside her plate. She hadn't spoken since the scream on the road, just stared at nothing, her eyes tracking things Silas couldn't see. He set the bowl in front of her. You need to eat something. She looked at the soup, then at him. Her lips moved, but no sound came out. It's all right, he said, sitting across from her. You don't have to talk if you're not ready. But she shook her head, frustrated. She tried again, her mouth forming words that wouldn't come, her small hands clenching into fists. Finally, she picked up the spoon and tapped it against the bowl 3 times, then 4, then 2. Silas watched, trying to understand. She tapped again, 3, 4, 2, then pointed at the music box. Something about the music box? She nodded hard, then tapped the pattern again. Her eyes were desperate, pleading. I don't understand, sweetheart. Can you show me? Cora pushed back from the table and ran to her room. Silas heard drawers opening, something falling. She came back with a piece of paper and a pencil, supplies Doc Ruth had left for her. Her hand shook as she drew, the lines rough and uncertain. A cup, steam rising from it, a hand pouring something from a small bottle. Silas felt his chest tighten. You saw Vernon put something in your mother's tea. Cora nodded, tears spilling down her cheeks now. She drew more, her mother drinking, then lying down, then her face twisted in pain. The drawings were crude but clear, a child's witness to murder. How many times did you see this? She held up 3 fingers, then 4, then 2. She wasn't sure, the memory fractured by fear and time. That's why you won't talk to him, because you know. She dropped the pencil and wrapped her arms around herself, sobbing silent and hard. Silas moved around the table and knelt beside her, and she collapsed against him, shaking with everything she'd been holding back for 3 weeks. I believe you, he said into her hair. I believe every word you're not saying, and we're going to make them believe you too. After she cried herself out, after he'd carried her to bed and tucked the blankets around her, Silas sat on the edge of her mattress in the dark. The music box sat on the nightstand, its brass hinge catching the moonlight through the window. Can I ask you something? He said quietly. Cora's eyes opened. She nodded. My daughter, her name was Clara. She was 7 when she died. Scarlet fever, 5 years ago. His voice caught, but he pushed through. She had a music box, too. Different song, but the same kind of box. After she died, I couldn't look at it, couldn't wind it up. The sound just hurt too much. Cora watched him, waiting. But you hold on to yours, even when it hurts. Why? She reached for the box, turned it over in her small hands. Then she mimed winding it, but didn't, just held it close and closed her eyes. It helps you remember her, Silas said. The good parts, before Vernon. She nodded. Your mama loved you something fierce. I could see that even in the blizzard, the way she held on to keep you safe. He touched the box gently. Maybe someday you'll be ready to hear its song again, and when you are, I'll be right here with you. Cora's hand found his. She squeezed once, then twice, then settled into sleep, still holding on. Ezra's forge was alive with heat and light when Silas arrived the next morning. The smell of hot iron and coal smoke hit him as soon as he dismounted. Inside, 4 people waited. Ezra at his anvil, Doc Ruth with her medical bag, Father Brennan clutching his Bible, and Chief White Elk of the Blackfoot tribe. An elder Silas had met only twice before at cattle trades. We called this council, Ezra said, his voice rough from smoke, because we're losing the legal fight. Vernon's suicide story is spreading. The town's turning. We need a new strategy. Doc Ruth stepped forward. I can testify about the arsenic timeline, but without Cora's testimony, it's circumstantial. The lawyer will argue Helen could have taken it herself over 3 months. The child can't testify, Silas said. She's too afraid, and even if she could, a judge won't take a 9-year-old's word over an adult's without corroboration. Father Brennan's hands tightened on his Bible. The leather creaked. Helen came to confession the week before she died. She told me Vernon had threatened her, said if she didn't sell the land, he'd find a way to take it himself. She asked God to protect Cora from him. The forge hissed as Ezra pulled another piece of iron from the coals. That's confession. You can't break the seal. I know what it would cost me. Father Brennan's voice was steady, but his eyes showed the weight of it. Defrocking. Excommunication. My soul's damnation according to church law, but if I stay silent, a child loses everything to her mother's killer. Some laws. He looked at the fire. Some laws are smaller than others. Chief White Elk spoke for the first time, his voice deep and measured. I have watched the child. She has the cheekbones of the Hayes women. Her grandmother was named Running Doe, my cousin's daughter. She married a white settler in 1862, took his name. The Hayes claim sits on land covered by the 1855 Blackfoot Treaty. Silas turned to him, What does that mean? It means if Cora carries Blackfoot blood through her grandmother, her land claim falls under tribal jurisdiction. Federal treaty law supersedes territorial land office. Vernon's claim, filed through the territory, becomes invalid if the Hayes lineage predates it and includes tribal heritage. Ezra set his hammer down. Can you prove the lineage? The mission records have it: birth, baptism, marriage, and the treaty documents in Helena list Running Doe's original allotment, the same 2,000 acres Helen inherited. Chief White Elk's eyes were sharp. But I need time to gather the documents. 2 weeks, maybe 3. The custody hearing is in 9 days, Doc Ruth said. Then we force a delay, or we change the venue. Ezra looked at each of them. We make this hearing public, hold it here, at the forge. Make Vernon face the whole town while we present every piece of evidence. Medical, spiritual, tribal. Make him answer in front of witnesses who can't be dismissed as easily as paperwork. Father Brennan's hand moved to his collar, touching the white tab that marked his office. If I testify, I'll lose everything I've built here. 30 years of ministry. But a child keeps her life, Doc Ruth said quietly. The old priest closed his eyes. When he opened them, they were clear. Then I'll testify. May God have mercy on my soul, because the church won't. Chief White Elk stood. I'll ride to the reservation tonight, gather the elders, bring the treaty documents. If we're making this a public trial, then let's do it right. Let the whole territory see what justice looks like when it's done in daylight. Silas looked at the 4 of them: a blacksmith, a doctor, a priest, and a tribal elder. An unlikely alliance bound by one thing: a child who'd lost everything but hope. How do we convince Judge Blackwood to allow it? He asked. Ezra's smile was grim. We don't ask permission. We make it happen and dare Vernon to object in front of 200 witnesses. Outside, the February wind was shifting. The snow had stopped, and somewhere in the distance Silas could hear water dripping from the forge roof. The first sound of thaw, slow and stubborn, but coming. The barn fire started just past midnight. Silas woke to the sound of horses screaming and the smell of smoke cutting through his dreams. He ran barefoot through snow, his rifle in hand, and found flames climbing the hay barn's south wall, orange light turning the night into day. 2 men on horseback circled the property line, torches in hand. Silas raised his rifle, but before he could fire, 6 more riders came from the darkness. Ezra's ranch hands, summoned by some warning Silas hadn't heard. They cut off the arsonist's escape, rifles leveled, voices hard and certain. Drop the torches, boys, Ezra called from his saddle. You're done here. The 2 men, Garrick and Howell, known troublemakers who worked odd jobs for anyone with coin, hesitated. Then Garrick spat in the snow. Vernon Caldwell paid us $20 each. Said Drummond needed a reminder about interfering in family business. Sheriff's gonna love hearing that, Ezra said. Now drop those torches before someone gets hurt. They dropped them. Ezra's men tied their hands while Silas and 3 others fought the fire with buckets and snow. It took an hour to beat it back, the flames hissing and spitting as water hit them. By dawn, half the barn was charred black, but the horses were safe. Sheriff Dawes arrived as the sun broke over the mountains. He arrested Garrick and Howell, listened to their confession, then rode toward Vernon's claim with his deputy. Silas watched them go, his hands blistered from the bucket handles, his lungs raw from smoke. Cora stood on the porch in her nightgown, that music box clutched against her chest. She hadn't made a sound during the whole ordeal, just watched the flames like they were something she'd seen before. Ezra dismounted and walked to Silas, his face streaked with soot. Vernon's getting desperate. That's good and bad. Good because desperate men make mistakes. Bad because desperate men don't stop. The sheriff arrested his hired hands. That's something. Vernon will make bail for them by noon, mark my words. And next time, he'll send men who don't talk. Ezra looked at the burned barn, at the horses milling nervous in the corral. We need to move faster. That public hearing, it has to be soon. By afternoon, Garrick and Howell were out on bail, just as Ezra predicted. Vernon paid it himself, making a show of arriving at the jail with cash and concern. Silas heard about it from Doc Ruth, who'd been at the mercantile when Vernon walked past, tipping his hat to the ladies like he hadn't just paid for arson. That evening, Silas sat with Cora at the kitchen table. She'd drawn more pictures, her mother's face, the music box, a house that might have been their old homestead. She pushed them toward him one by one, her way of telling stories she couldn't speak. I need to ask you something, Silas said gently. That music box, your mama gave it to you? Cora nodded. Did she ever open it? Show you anything inside? Cora's eyes went distant. She picked up the box, turned it over in her hands. Her fingers traced the seam where the lid met the base, then moved to the tiny brass hinge. She looked at Silas, a question in her eyes. Go ahead, he said. If there's something in there your mama wanted you to find, now might be the time. She worked at the hinge carefully, her small fingers patient. The box opened slow, the mechanism stiff from years of use. Inside, the brass cylinder with its tiny pins sat ready to play, but Cora reached past it, pressing on the velvet lining of the lid. It gave way, a false bottom barely visible, and underneath, a piece of paper folded tight. Silas held his breath as she unfolded it. The paper was old, the edges worn, but the pencil lines were still clear. A hand-drawn map, survey stakes marked with dates and measurements, creek boundaries, property lines, and at the bottom, in careful print, Hayes' claim, April 12th, 1880, Running Doe Hayes. Your grandmother drew this, Silas said, his voice barely above a whisper. Cora nodded, tears sliding down her cheeks. The map showed stakes along the creek boundary, the same boundary Vernon claimed in his 1880 filing, but these stakes were dated 6 months earlier. April versus October. If they could find those physical stakes, if they were still standing after 6 years of weather and time, Vernon's claim would collapse like a house built on sand. Ezra arrived within the hour, summoned by a rider Silas sent. Doc Ruth came with him. They spread the map on the kitchen table, weighing the corners with coffee cups and studying every line. This is it, Ezra said. This proves the Hayes claim predates Vernon's by half a year. Land office rules say first claim wins, and this is dated and signed by Cora's grandmother. Vernon's filing was October 1880, Doc Ruth added. If we can find even one of these stakes with the April date carved in it, his whole case falls apart. The creek's all still frozen, Silas said. But the thaw's starting. Another week, maybe 2, we can search the boundary. We don't have 2 weeks. The hearing's in 5 days. Ezra looked at the map again, then at Cora. How long have you known this was in there? Cora held up her hand, fingers and thumbs splayed. 5 days. She'd known since the night her mother died, when Helen pressed the music box into her frozen hands and whispered something Silas hadn't heard. Some last instruction, mother to daughter, about where the truth was hidden. Why didn't you show anyone before now? Doc Ruth asked gently. Cora picked up her pencil and drew a man's face, angry. Vernon. Then she drew herself, small and alone. She tapped the paper, afraid. You thought if Vernon knew about the map, he'd take it, or destroy it. Silas touched her shoulder. You were protecting it, protecting what your mama left you. She nodded, exhausted. Father Brennan arrived after dark, his horse steaming in the cold. He'd ridden from the mission with news. Chief White Elk had the treaty documents and the lineage records. Running Doe Hayes, born 1840, married Samuel Hayes, 1862, died 1878, mother of Helen, grandmother of Cora. The bloodline was documented, witnessed, filed with both the mission and the tribal council. The chief says he'll present it at a public hearing, Father Brennan said. He wants the whole territory to see, wants Vernon to face tribal law as well as territorial law. When? Silas asked. 3 days from now, at Ezra's Forge, dawn. He's already sending word, every homesteader, every rancher within 50 miles. This won't be a quiet courthouse proceeding. This will be a reckoning. Through the window, the night was clear and cold. Stars scattered across black sky like salt thrown on a table. And somewhere out there, Vernon Caldwell was planning his next move, unaware that a 9-year-old girl had just taken his last piece off the board. Judge Blackwood wanted Cora's testimony. She called Silas to her chambers 2 days before the public hearing, the room smelling of pipe smoke and old law books stacked floor to ceiling. Vernon sat with his lawyer on one side of the table, Silas on the other. Cora stood beside him, her hand gripping his coat sleeve, the music box under her other arm. Miss Hayes, the judge said, her voice gentle but firm, I need you to tell me what you saw. Did your uncle visit your mother before she died? Cora's eyes went blank. Her breathing quickened. It's all right, Judge Blackwood continued. You're safe here. Did you see him give your mother anything? Tea, medicine, anything at all? Cora's chest rose and fell faster. Her face drained white. Cora, Vernon said from across the table, his voice honey smooth. It's Uncle Vernon. You know I loved your mama. I would never hurt her. Tell the judge the truth, sweetheart. The trembling started in her hands and spread through her whole body. Her eyes rolled back, her knees buckled, and Silas caught her before she hit the floor. "That's enough," he said, his voice hard as iron. "We're done here." "Mr. Drummond," the judge began, "I said we're done." He lifted Cora, her body rigid and shaking in his arms. "You want testimony from a child this traumatized. You're asking me to break her. I won't do it. Not for you, not for justice, not for anything." Vernon's lawyer leaned back in his chair. "Your Honor, without the child's testimony, Mr. Drummond's case is entirely circumstantial. The medical evidence is inconclusive regarding intent. The map is interesting but doesn't prove murder. And Mr. Drummond has just demonstrated he cannot produce his key witness." Judge Blackwood looked at Cora's unconscious form, then at Silas. Her expression was unreadable. "I'm ordering a medical evaluation by Dr. Holloway. If the child cannot testify without severe psychological harm, I'll take that into consideration. But, Mr. Drummond, you should know, without her voice, your case is weak. Bloodkin has presumptive rights, and Vernon Caldwell has presented compelling evidence that his sister took her own life." "She didn't," Silas said through clenched teeth. "And I'll prove it." Outside, Doc Ruth was waiting with her buggy. She examined Cora in the back, checking her pulse, her breathing, the way her eyes moved behind closed lids. "Panic attack," Doc Ruth said. "Severe. She'll come around, but Silas, you can't put her through that again. Her mind will break before she gets the words out." "I know." He looked at Cora's pale face, at the music box still clutched against her chest even in unconsciousness. "We'll find another way." That night, Ezra's forge burned brighter than usual. Word had spread through the territory like wildfire. A public hearing at dawn, 2 days hence. Everyone was invited. Everyone was expected. The smell of hot iron filled the blacksmith yard as Ezra prepared the space, setting up benches borrowed from the church, clearing the center area for speakers. Doc Ruth arrived first, then Father Brennan. Chief White Elk came with 3 tribal elders carrying document cases wrapped in oilcloth. By midnight, 20 people were gathered around the forge, planning testimony, reviewing evidence, preparing for what Ezra called frontier justice, the kind that happens when courts move too slow and truth can't wait. "Vernon will bring his lawyer," Doc Ruth said. "He'll object to the venue, the format, everything." Let him object to 200 witnesses," Ezra replied. He struck his anvil once, the sound ringing clear. "This forge is where truth gets hammered out in Bitterroot. Has been for 20 years. Men bring their disputes here, we talk them through, and the community decides what's right. Vernon can hide behind lawyers in a courtroom, but out here, he faces his neighbors." Father Brennan set a wooden box on Ezra's workbench. Inside, wrapped in velvet, was his confession ledger, the record of every confession he'd heard in 30 years. Helen Hayes' entry was marked with a black ribbon. "If I read from this," he said quietly, "I violate sacred law. The bishop will excommunicate me. I'll lose my parish, my pension, my standing in the church, everything I've built." "You don't have to do this," Silas said. "Yes, I do." The priest's hand trembled as he touched the ledger. "Helen came to me in desperation. She said Vernon threatened her, told her if she didn't sign over the mineral rights, he'd find another way. She was terrified, not suicidal. And God forgive me, I told her to pray, to have faith that God would protect her." His voice broke. "He didn't, so now I have to." Chief White Elk spread the treaty documents across the bench. Yellowed paper, wax seals intact, signatures from 1855 when the Blackfoot ceded land to the territory in exchange for specific protections. Running Doe's name appeared on the allotment list, her parcel clearly marked. "The Hayes claim sits on land protected under Article 7, the chief explained. "Any descendant with documented Blackfoot blood holds priority over settler filings. Cora's lineage is clear: birth records, baptism, mission school enrollment. Her grandmother's blood gives her rights Vernon's claim can't touch." "Will the territorial court recognize tribal jurisdiction?" Doc Ruth asked. "They have to. It's federal treaty law. Supersedes everything." Chief White Elk's smile was thin. Vernon thought he was stealing from a widow and orphan. He didn't know he was stealing from the Blackfoot Nation. They worked through the night, building the case piece by piece. Medical evidence, confession testimony, tribal lineage, the map. Each element alone was circumstantial, but together they formed a web Vernon couldn't escape. Silas stepped outside near dawn, needing air. The March sky was turning gray at the edges, and he could smell moisture in the wind. More snow coming, or maybe rain. The seasons were shifting, winter losing its grip 1 degree at a time. Cora appeared in the doorway behind him, wrapped in a blanket Doc Ruth had given her. She'd woken an hour ago and hadn't left Silas's side since. Now she tugged on his sleeve and held up her hand, fingers forming letters he'd been teaching her. Slow and careful, she spelled S-C-A-R-E-D. Me too, he admitted. She spelled again, W-I-L-L-H-E-W-I-N. Silas knelt so they were eye to eye. I don't know, but I know this. Every person in that forge tomorrow is fighting for you. Doc Ruth, Ezra, Father Brennan, Chief White Elk. They're all risking something to tell your truth, and that's worth more than Vernon's lies, no matter how many lawyers he brings. She nodded slowly, then spelled one more word, M-A-M-A. Your mama would be proud of you. You held on to that map, kept it safe when Vernon would have destroyed it. You're braver than you know. Cora leaned against him, and they stood together watching the dawn break gray and cold over Montana. In 12 hours, the territory would gather at Ezra's forge, and Vernon Caldwell would face more than a judge. He'd face a town that was finally ready to choose truth over comfort. Inside, Ezra struck his anvil 3 times, the signal that echoed across Bitterroot when something important was about to happen. The sound rang through the valley, carried on the March wind, and Silas knew that by sunset, 200 souls would be standing witness. Vernon Caldwell's day of reckoning had come. Dawn came cold and clear. By the time the sun broke over the mountains, nearly 200 people had gathered at Ezra's forge. They came on horseback in wagons, on foot through the mud, where the snow had melted. Ranchers in worn leather coats stood beside homesteaders in patched wool. The church ladies came, and the railroad men, and families from homesteads 50 miles out who'd heard Ezra's anvil ring and knew something important was happening. The forge fire roared at the center of it all, sending sparks up into the pale sky. The smell of hot iron and coal smoke mixed with horses and humanity pressed close. Ezra stood at his anvil, hammer in hand, waiting. Vernon arrived with his lawyer and 6 hired men, not the fumbling arsonists from before, but hard-faced guns for hire who sat their horses with practiced ease. Vernon dismounted slow, making a show of adjusting his coat, his eyes scanning the crowd with something between contempt and calculation. Judge Blackwood came last, riding in her official capacity though this wasn't her courtroom. She positioned herself near the forge, neither approving nor condemning the venue, simply bearing witness to what the territory had decided needed witnessing. Sheriff Dawes stood off to the side, his hand near his gun, watching Vernon's hired men with careful attention. Ezra struck his anvil once. The crowd fell silent. We're gathered here because the law moves slow and truth can't wait, Ezra began, his voice carrying across the yard. Helen Hayes died 3 months ago. Her daughter Cora stands orphaned, and 2 men claim the right to raise her, one by blood, one by a dying woman's plea. Today, we hear testimony. Today, we see evidence. And today, this community decides what justice looks like. Vernon's lawyer stood. This is highly irregular, Your Honor. There are proper legal channels. And they'll still be there tomorrow, Judge Blackwood said. But today, I'm listening. Proceed, Mr. Tate. Doc Ruth testified first. She laid out the medical evidence in clear, unflinching terms. The progression of symptoms, the arsenic in the bone marrow, the 3-month timeline that matched perfectly with Vernon's increased visits to his sister. She produced Helen's medical file, each entry dated and signed. Arsenic poisoning can be suicide or murder, she concluded. The difference is intent, and I'm here to tell you, Helen Hayes was not suicidal. She was planning spring planting. She was teaching her daughter to read. She was fighting to keep her land. That's not a woman ready to die. Vernon's lawyer cross-examined, but Doc Ruth held firm. The crowd listened, faces grim. Father Brennan stepped forward next. His hands shook as he opened his confession ledger. The white collar at his throat seemed to choke him, but his voice was steady. I'm about to violate the sacred seal of confession, he said. The church will excommunicate me for this. I'll lose everything I've built in 30 years of service, but I'm choosing the living over the dead and a child's future over my own soul. He read from the ledger. Helen's confession, dated 3 weeks before her death, Vernon's threats, his demands that she sell the mineral rights, her refusal, her fear that he would find another way to take what wasn't his, her plea for God's protection for Cora if anything happened. The crowd shifted. Mrs. Potts, who'd been Vernon's loudest defender, put her hand to her mouth. Mrs. Chen looked at the ground. Helen Hayes came to me terrified, Father Brennan finished. Not suicidal. Terrified of her own brother, and I failed to protect her. But I won't fail her daughter. Vernon stood, his face flushed. That confession is privileged. You can't. I just did, Father Brennan said quietly. And I'll answer to God for it. But you'll answer to this town. Chief White Elk rose, and the crowd quieted further. He carried the treaty documents like they were sacred text, which in a way they were. He laid them on Ezra's workbench, the wax seals catching firelight. In 1855, the Blackfoot Nation signed a treaty with the United States government, he began. Article 7 protects the land rights of any tribal member and their descendants in perpetuity. Running Doe Hayes, Cora's grandmother, was Blackfoot. Her allotment was 2,000 acres along this creek. He produced the mission records, birth certificates, baptismal records, marriage license, a chain of documentation that ran from Running Doe to Helen to Cora, unbroken and witnessed. Vernon Caldwell filed his claim in October 1880 through the Territorial Land Office. But Cora Hayes holds her grandmother's claim from 1862, validated under federal treaty. Territorial filings don't supersede federal law. They never have. Vernon's lawyer tried to object, but Chief White Elk simply laid out the map Cora had hidden in her music box. The hand-drawn survey, dated April 1880, signed by Running Doe Hayes 6 months before Vernon's filing. We searched the creek boundary yesterday, Chief White Elk continued. Found 4 of the original survey stakes still standing, iron markers with dates carved in, April 12, 1880. Every one predates Caldwell's claim. He gestured, and 2 Blackfoot warriors carried forward the physical stakes, iron posts weathered but readable. They set them beside the forge, and the crowd pressed closer to see the carved dates. Vernon's face had gone white. His lawyer shuffled papers, looking for an argument that wasn't there. Ezra struck his anvil twice. One more piece of evidence. He produced the receipts he'd been gathering. Vernon's meetings with Anaconda Copper representatives, the preliminary mining contract dated January 5th, 10 days before Helen died. The contract showed Vernon had already negotiated to sell mineral rights for $5,000, taking a $2,000 advance. He spent that advance on gambling debts, Ezra said. Telegraph records show he wired money to 3 separate creditors in Helena the same week. He needed that land sold fast, needed the full payment to clear his obligations, and Helen was in the way. The crowd murmured, anger building like steam. Someone shouted, "Murderer!" Another voice joined, "He killed his own sister." Sheriff Dawes moved closer to Vernon, his hand on his gun now. Judge Blackwood stood. "Mr. Caldwell, I'm issuing a warrant for your arrest on suspicion of murder, fraud, and conspiracy to commit arson. Sheriff Dawes, take him into custody." Vernon's hired guns tensed, hands moving toward their weapons. But Chief White Elk's warriors had positioned themselves throughout the crowd, and Ezra's ranch hands had rifles visible. Vernon was outnumbered 20-1. "Don't," Sheriff Dawes said quietly to the hired men. "You'll die here, and for what? His coin isn't worth your lives." The guns lowered. Vernon looked around wildly, seeing 200 faces staring back at him, people he'd lived beside, traded with, shared whiskey with at the saloon, all of them now seeing him for what he was. "This is a lynching," he spat. "Not justice. A goddamn lynching dressed up in legal paper." "No," Judge Blackwood said. "This is what happens when the law works too slow and the truth comes out anyway. You'll get your trial, Mr. Caldwell, in a proper courtroom with a proper jury. But right now, you're under arrest." Sheriff Dawes cuffed Vernon's hands behind his back. As he led him towards the jail wagon, Vernon turned back to Silas one last time. "You think you've won," he said, his voice shaking with rage and fear. "You think you've saved her, but that land's cursed now, cursed by what you've done here today." Silas stepped forward, Cora's hand in his. "The only curse here is you, and we just broke it." Vernon was loaded into the wagon. His hired men scattered, leaving him alone. And as the sheriff drove away through the mud, the crowd began to disperse. Not in celebration, but in quiet satisfaction. Justice had been served. Messy, public, frontier justice, but justice nonetheless. Judge Blackwood approached Silas and Cora. "I'm granting you permanent guardianship, Mr. Drummond, and I'm ordering the land patent refiled in Cora's name with you as trustee until she reaches majority age. The mineral rights stay with her, untouched." Silas nodded, unable to speak. The judge knelt in front of Cora. "Your mother would be proud of you, child, and your grandmother. You held on to the truth when it would have been easier to let it go." Cora's hand tightened in Silas's. She didn't smile. The weight of everything was still too heavy, but something in her eyes had shifted. Fear was starting to give way to something else. Not quite hope, not yet, but the possibility of it. Vernon Caldwell's trial lasted 3 days in Helena. The evidence was overwhelming. Medical testimony, confession records, tribal documents, the mining contract with its advance payment traced directly to his creditors. The jury deliberated for 40 minutes before returning a guilty verdict on all counts: murder, fraud, conspiracy. The judge sentenced him to hang. Silas didn't attend the execution that summer. He stayed home with Cora, working the ranch, teaching her to ride, watching her slowly learn to speak again. Her first words came in April, whispered at bedtime. "Thank you, Papa." He'd wept like a child. The land patent was refiled in May. Just as the valley turned green, Judge Blackwood came to the ranch herself to witness the signing, along with Chief White Elk, Doc Ruth, Ezra, and Father Brennan, the unlikely alliance that had fought for one orphaned girl and won. The document was formal and legal, dense with territorial language, but the heart of it was simple. 2,000 acres held in trust for Cora Hayes until her 21st birthday, with Silas Drummond as guardian and trustee. The mineral rights stayed with her, untouched. $50,000 in copper that Vernon had killed for and never claimed. They signed it at dawn on Ezra's workbench, the forge cold now, but the space still sacred. The smell of old iron and coal dust hung in the air. Chief White Elk blessed Cora and Blackfoot, giving her a name that translated to Brave Heart Woman. Doc Ruth presented her with Helen's nursing journal, saved from the old homestead. Father Brennan, wearing civilian clothes now, the church had made good on its threat, offered a simple prayer. Ezra forged a new hinge for the music box, replacing the one that had grown loose from constant handling. "So it lasts another 50 years, he said, winking at Cora. She wound it for the first time since her mother's death. The melody played clear and true, Red River Valley, the song her grandmother had sung, her mother had cherished, and now she would carry forward. The sound drifted across the greening land, and Silas thought he saw Helen's face in the morning light, just for a moment, smiling. After the ceremony, they rode to the cemetery. Cora carried prairie roses, the first blooms of spring. She placed them on 2 graves, her mother's, and beside it, Clara Drummond's smaller stone. "Mama," she said softly, her voice still uncertain but growing stronger. "This is Clara. She's my sister now. Papa says she would have liked me." Silas's throat closed. He knelt beside her. "She would have loved you." Cora looked at both stones, then at Silas. "We're family now. All of us, even the ones who went before." "Yes," he managed. "We are." They stood there in the morning sun, the smell of wet earth and new grass rising around them, and Silas understood something he hadn't before. Family wasn't just the living, it was the dead who made room in their absence. The spaces they left that others could fill. Clara had died so he could understand grief. Martha had died so he could understand loss. And Helen had died so he could understand what it meant to fight for someone else's child with everything you had. Not replacement, continuation, one story flowing into the next like water seeking the sea. That evening, they ate supper with Ezra and Doc Ruth at the ranch. Simple food, beans and cornbread, coffee strong enough to strip paint. Cora sat between them all, talking more than she had in months, telling a story about a butterfly she'd chased through the meadow. Doc Ruth caught Silas's eye across the table and smiled. She'd been right, months ago in the February cold. Hard country doesn't forgive half measures. You're all in or you're dead. He'd gone all in, and somehow, miraculously, they'd both survived. After the guests left, Silas and Cora sat on the porch in the twilight. The music box rested between them on the bench, its new hinge gleaming. Lightning bugs rose from the grass, and somewhere a coyote called to the rising moon. "Papa," Cora said, the name still new in her mouth but growing familiar. "Will we be all right now?" Silas thought about that, about Vernon hanging in Helena, about the land secure, about the copper in the ground, waiting for when she was old enough to decide what to do with it, about the long years ahead, the challenges still to come, the grief that would always be there but didn't have to define them. "Yes," he said finally. "I think we will." She leaned against his shoulder, and they watched the stars come out one by one over Montana. The winter had been hard and long, but spring had come anyway. It always did, if you survived long enough to see it, and they had. Spring came slow to Montana that year, the kind of slow that makes a man appreciate warmth after a killing winter. Silas Drummond stood at his fence line in late May, watching Cora chase butterflies through grass that had finally decided to grow. Her laughter, something he'd thought he'd never hear, rang clear as Sunday bells across the valley. 52 years he'd walked this earth, lost a wife to grief, lost a daughter to fever, thought he'd lost the right to hope. Then a blizzard brought him a dying woman's last words and a child's frozen hands, and he learned something about second chances that all his years of solitude hadn't taught him. Vernon Caldwell hanged in July. Silas didn't attend, didn't need to watch the dirt get shoveled. Some men dig their own graves with greed, the rest is just formality. The 2,000 acres stayed in Cora's name, copper and all. $50,000 she'd inherit at 21. Silas never touched a dime. That wasn't what he'd fought for. Doc Ruth said once, after it was all over, "Hard country don't forgive half measures, Silas. You're all in or you're dead." He reckoned she was right. You don't rescue a child from a blizzard halfway. You don't fight for family with one hand behind your back. You go all in, consequences be damned, and trust the iron will hold when it's tested in the fire. Cora ran to him now, breathless, holding prairie roses in her small fist. "For Mama's grave," she said, "and for Clara too." He took her hand, warm skin, strong grip, alive. They walked together toward the 2 stones under the cottonwood, where the dead rested and the living remembered. Blood didn't make them family. A blizzard did, a dying woman's plea, a town that finally chose truth over comfort, and a little girl who taught a broken man that hearts full of grief still have room for love, sometimes more room than hearts that never broke at all. Some stories don't end. They just keep going, warmer and brighter, like spring after winter, like hope after loss, like family you choose instead of the family you're born with. The music box sat on the kitchen table at home, wound and ready, waiting for the next time they needed to remember, waiting to play its song for another 50 years. And the land, 2,000 acres of Montana earth, would wait too, patient as stone, rich as promises kept, holding its copper secret until the day Cora was ready to decide what her inheritance really meant. Not the money, never the money. The choice to fight for what's right, even when the law moves slow and the night is cold and you're standing alone against men who'd rather you disappeared. That was the real inheritance. And it was worth more than all the copper in the ground.